Joining me now is David Corn, the Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones and an analyst for MSNBC. He is the author of the bestseller American Psychosis, a historical perspective of how the Republican Party went crazy. Rachel Maddow said, "This is a cautionary tale for what's happened today and is a reminder that we've dealt with some of these dynamics before." David, thank you so much for joining me on At the Table.
Great to be with you, Lynn.
So, David, you've written many bestsellers, but this one is different for you because it's history. Tell me why you wrote the book.
You're right. It is history. Most of the books I've done in the past have been more like current history, recent events, although I did do one book about a CIA officer, and that was a bit of a history of the CIA, but that was a long time ago. This was out of form for me. And I don't know, about a year and a half ago, I was thinking about the relationship between the Republican Party and extremism, far-right fanaticism. And I said, someone must have written a book on this. Let's go out and look. And I found a lot of good books on the history of the Republican Party. In fact, Heather Cox Richardson, a current historian, is very popular with her newsletter, wrote a great book that was the history of the Republican Party from the 1850s until the present day. But I found no one who looked at this particular element of the Republican Party, its ties to the far-right extremism over the last 70 years. And, we all know the expression, be the change you want to be. Well, sometimes you have to write the book you want to read. And I said, no one's done this. I'm interested. I will start looking into this. And, pieces of it have all been part of other books and other histories, but there's nobody who's come along and done sort of the through line of how the Republican Party, starting really after World War II, always had in its DNA this relationship with, this courting of, this dance with, this flirtation with extremism, which can mean racism, bigotry, conspiracy theory, paranoia, tribalism, division, demagoguery. And it's always has been there. So what we see with Trump and Trumpism and the MAGA takeover of the Republican Party, while it certainly feels new and maybe more extreme, it is the continuation of a long-term element that's always been part of the GOP.
In fact, you write that what you chronicle is in the footsteps, and you chronicle and follow what happened from McCarthy, Goldwater, Nixon, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, McCain, Palin, Romney, and other Republicans. And you conclude that Trump had embraced, empowered, and tapped the menacing forces of far-right extremism. He did it more extensively, more cynically, and more explicitly than his predecessors, and he did so to commandeer the party. So take us from the beginning. I mean, you start, and I mean, you cover so much, from the John Birch Society roots to, which now seems like ancient history, but how can you tie together what started during what might have been seen as the red baiting of the McCarthy era? You take us to the book, and it's just a straight line to today and maybe even tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, the book even goes back to the Salem witch trials, but the real thrust of the story starts in the late 40s and early 50s. In World War, in the mid 40s, the Republican Party was basically decimated, right? It was down to, a dozen senators and a very, very small number of members of the House of Representatives. Why? Obviously, because the party had been wrong about its allegiance to laissez-faire capitalism, which ended with the 1929 crash, becoming the party of big business, made it look pretty lousy in the 30s and 40s. And prior to the start of World War II, the Republican Party was a hotbed of isolationism. Isolationism, American First Committee, it did involve and did include some Democrats, but it was mainly Republicans. And they turned out to be wrong about Hitler and the threat of Nazi Germany. And so it was pretty clear that the Republican Party had bet wrong on the two biggest issues of the first half of the 20th century. So it wasn't surprising that their ranks were decimated in the US Congress. But in the mid and late 40s, they latched on to something new. And that was red baiting, the fear of communism and the Soviet Union. That's how Richard Nixon started his political career as a congressman, then as a senator. And they started attacking the Democrats for basically being soft in communism. Nixon, who came to the fore with the Alger Hiss case, was, I don't know if this is a word, was leapfrogged by Joe McCarthy, the junior senator from the great state of Wisconsin, a Republican. He declared that he had a list of 200 and so communists who were in the State Department, and that the State Department was doing nothing about it. This was McCarthy's way of saying that the Truman administration was riddled with communist spies and agents, and he went really even further. In 1951, on the floor of the Senate, he gave a speech saying there was an immense conspiracy, immense was his word, that wanted to basically destroy America and hand it over to the Soviet Union. And that the leader of this conspiracy, which included people throughout the administration, the Truman administration, and members of the elite academia, the media, and corporate leaders, that the leader of this conspiracy was a man named George C. Marshall. He happened to be the Secretary of Defense at the time. He had been Secretary of State and had saved Europe with the Marshall Plan. And even more, bizarre in terms of his relationship to this conspiracy, he had been one of the commanding generals during World War II that helped the US win the war. So here was McCarthy saying there was this conspiracy led by George C. Marshall and other elites to not that they were just wrong in their policies about the Soviet Union and foreign policy, that they were actively working to basically annihilate the United States from within. And that was their plan, that was their purpose. This is QAnon without eating babies and sex trafficking. It was a crazy, nutty conspiracy theory that the Republican Party embraced because it resonated with millions of Americans who were scared and worried in the early days of the Cold War and this new experience that Americans were having with nuclear terror, the notion that the whole world could be obliterated at a moment's notice. This was just a few years old at this point in time. And so McCarthy registered, and the Republican Party saw him winning elections while he campaigned for other Republicans, and they lionized him initially. In 1952, he was running for re-election, and Eisenhower was running for the presidency. For the first time, he'd been the leader of the D-Day forces, and he'd become president of Columbia University. And he was campaigning, and this is one of my favorite stories in the book, chapter 3. He and McCarthy were both on the ticket in Wisconsin. They campaigned together in whistle stopping on a train, which is what they used to do, throughout Wisconsin in October of 52. And Eisenhower hated McCarthy. George C. Marshall was a colleague, and friend of his. He knew he wasn't leading any immense conspiracy. He knew that McCarthy was a scoundrel, a liar, a fearmonger, and he despised him for all of that. And so he told a junior speechwriter to put into the draft of the speech, the big speech he was going to do at the big rally at Marquette University in Milwaukee at the end of that day of campaigning, with McCarthy on the stage. He was going to, he asked for a paragraph in which he would basically denounce McCarthy, not by name, but he would defend Marshall, and he would make it clear that he had no respect for McCarthy. It would have been a BFD, as we say these days, a big deal. And so the paragraph went in. Eisenhower was ready to say this in front of 15,000 people with McCarthy next to him. And on the train, Republican poobahs got wind of this. The head of the RNC was on the train. The head of the Wisconsin governor, who was a Republican, was on the train, and Governor of New Hampshire, Sherman Adams, who was Eisenhower's top advisor and chief of staff, was on the train. When they got wind of this, they had what you might call conniptions. And Adams went to Eisenhower, said, "You can't do this. This may cost us Wisconsin in the presidential election." And even more importantly, McCarthy had drawn millions of Catholic voters into the Republican Party, Catholic voters who had up to then primarily been Democrats, with the Republican Party for many years having a strong anti-Catholic bias. So they feared that if Eisenhower attacked McCarthy, they would lose these voters in the presidential election and might lose Wisconsin. So Eisenhower looked at Adams and said, "Take it out." Boom, yes. That was it. He gave a speech that night that actually echoed a lot of what McCarthy said, that the Milwaukee Journal criticized Eisenhower for, calling it essentially light McCarthyism. So here was a chance, in some ways, maybe even the original sin of the Republican Party. The Republican Party, the establishment, had a chance to say what McCarthy was doing, his conspiracy theory, fear-mongering was wrong, but instead they accepted it because it worked. It brought in votes.
And actually, everyone who's listening, David's vivid account of this, if you just want to jump into it right away, is on pages between 41 and 43 in the book. If you want to, for those of you who have the book, to jump into it right away. But that's your whole point. McCarthy is dead, but McCarthyism lives. Mm-hmm. And again, it leads into what is Trumpism today. But you write at that time something that I'm going to jump ahead a minute to the present, and then we'll get back to the book, okay. Because you write about how even in those times, there was overt and covert anti-Semitism were coming out of World War II, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. You write about how his politics, the New Deal, was called the Jew Deal. And we're talking to you now on a day where Donald Trump just said one of his most explicit rants, and what I think it was a text or whatever, talking about American Jews and Israel. No Republican in the establishment has made a comment as we speak in a strong and forceful way, denouncing him for what was one of the most explicit anti-Semitic remarks, echoed, amplified by Kanye West, or Ye, who now has just used his billions to buy a social platform. David, can you talk about what you see as the Republican Party response to this latest example of anti-Semitism?
Well, yes, it feeds into the larger theme of the book, which is again and again and again, you see Republicans who know better, who think the extremism is indeed wrong and wouldn't engage in this extremism themselves, accepting it because it plays to their base and is politically useful for them. In 1964, if we move up from McCarthyism, you have the John Birch Society, which was McCarthyism on steroids. They believed in weather machines. They believed the commies were taking over PTAs and supermarkets and stores and everything. It was crazy. But Barry Goldwater, who actually had some Jewish lineage, you wanted them to be his volunteers and his supporters, and tried not to denounce the Birch Society, even though it was infiltrated or infected with not just conspiracism and crazy right-wing ideas, but also with racism and anti-Semitism. Right? So there was an instance when he actively conspired with William F. Buckley, the great conservative journalist of the day, to not disavow the John Birch Society. Buckley did that years later, but at that point, in the run-up to the 1964 election, they both wanted to keep the John Birch Society within the conservative movement, within the Republican Party base. So you see that again and again. You can look at George H.W. Bush And here's another, way that anti-Semitism plays into this. In 1988, a guy named Pat Robertson,
Oh, yeah.
far-right Christian nationalist, ran the Christian Broadcast Network, very successful business, made a lot of money. He ran for the Republican nomination in 1988, came in second in Iowa, but then lost. But he afterwards started the Christian Coalition to mobilize Christian voters. The Republican Party saw that as an opportunity for them, and they went to the conferences, they embraced it, they took donations from the Christian Coalition, and saw it really as part of their coalition way to bring troops and money into the Republican fold. Well, in 1990, I want to say, maybe 91, but it's in the book, Pat Robertson wrote a book called The New World Order. This was, as a Wall Street Journal said at the time, a collection of all the crackpot conspiracy theories that had ever come up in Western civilization. His basic point was that secret societies over the years, banks, elites, portions of the government had basically mounted a cabal to impose one world totalitarian government on all of us. And this included the Communist Party. And it also included, as he put it, the Rothschilds, which was
that's where we get going. Yeah.
A Jewish banking family in Europe that had long been the target of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And so here he was saying the commies, the Jewish bankers, secret societies like the Illuminati and the Masons were all in on this scheme. And he said, it wasn't just any scheme. It was a satanic scheme, that they literally were doing this in league with Lucifer so that he would reign over the world in this one world collectivist government. And he even went so far as to say that George Herbert Walker Bush, then the president, then the leader of the Republican Party, was an ally of this satanic cabal that included Jews. And so here is Pat Robertson writing this book. It sells a couple 100,000 copies. It's a bestseller. He is telling people who follow him nonsense, fear-mongering. It's anti-Semitic. It's anti-common sense. And it's lunatic. And so what happens? George H.W. Bush goes to the annual Christian Coalition Conference in Virginia, praises the group, praises Robertson, thanks him for saving the spiritual soul of America. So what's he doing is he's giving his seal of approval. He's conveying legitimacy, validation upon a crackpot, an anti-Semitic crackpot. And at the time, this is also part of the story. The media doesn't pick up on this. One person wrote about, as far as I could tell in the mainstream media, wrote about the book and how crazy it was and its political connotations. That was a fellow named Michael Isikoff, a friend of ours who I've written 2 books with, and he was working at the Washington Post at the time. But by and large, this nuttiness, in this case, this anti-Semitic nuttiness, is not acknowledged by the party. They turn a blind eye because they want the Christian Coalition voters. And the media doesn't really talk about this courtship of extremism. And again, we can see this happening, that they, so in some ways, I look at my book as a history of the dark side of the Republican Party that has always been there, that the party itself doesn't acknowledge, and that historians and I think journalists have often not acknowledged. And, going back to the earlier point, George H.W. Bush, by all accounts, was a decent fellow personally. Not, probably, I'm guessing not anti-Semitic, not racist. And, we could argue about his policies and a lot of things he did that I thought were wrong. But nevertheless, not someone who would actively promote anti-Semitism, but yet he did. He promoted and championed perhaps one of the most prominent anti-Semites of that moment. And no one said anything about it.
So here we are today. Dog whistles. Well, we're beyond dog whistles at the moment. I guess, at least we don't have to figure out what people are saying because Trump is just saying it. You don't have to wonder what he means. He says it. And, this kind of currency that the right wing has had has been able to stick now through decades. People like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who try to just tell you the sky is blue. I think you might have used that phrase in your book. How do we're arguing, or they are, or we who believe the sky is blue, if we could put us in that camp, how do you talk to people and convince them the sky is blue? Which I thought was kind of a nice, simple way of putting it, because we could agree, this is a pen I'm holding up, and we now are dealing with some people who will say, if you say so.
Right. Well, what's interesting to me, again, I'm sort of, my head is in this historical space here, is you look at what McCarthy said, which we talked about a moment ago, that there was an immense conspiracy run by the Secretary of Defense to literally destroy America from the inside. That was the main threat, not even the Soviet Union. It was a subversive threat. And millions of people believed it. It was irrational. There was no evidence produced. There was no, documentation. They accepted this. It played to their fears, and it was exploited by McCarthy and the rest of the Republican Party for many years until, they basically broke with him, but they didn't break with McCarthyism. And then you come up to today, 70 years later, and you have Donald Trump saying the election was stolen. It was the Chinese, the Venezuelans, Italian satellite, the CIA, the deep state, and all this other rubbish. And no proof, no evidence, no documentation. And yet tens of millions of people agree with that and follow him. And so you're saying, the sky is blue and that the election was legitimate. And they're saying, no, it's not. And then even in, a couple of weeks ago, he fully embraced the crazy QAnon theory, which is, again, that there's an elite out there that wants to control the world. And this elite also are cannibalistic. They eat babies. They traffic in sex, and in terms of, they in human trafficking for sexual purposes. They're pedophiles, and it includes the leaders of the Democratic Party, people in Hollywood, people in the media. Maybe you and I are on the list. It keeps changing. And they also believe that John F. Kennedy Jr. is not dead, and he's back alive and helping Donald Trump combat these forces. And one day they're going to round everybody up, ship them to Guantanamo, and regain control of the U.S. government. Again, crazy or crazier than what McCarthy said, and yet you can't argue. You can't, you saw on January 6th, you see with the Republican Party not accepting the legitimacy of the election. And so again and again and again, we see this irrational, this is what I call the book American Psychosis, this irrationality seizing large parts of the population, and the Republican Party exploiting it and countenancing it and encouraging it. And it's a very difficult thing, I think, for sane or rational people, but also the media and even for the Democrats to figure out how to contend with.
So here's a thought. We'll get back to the book for a moment. So David Corn does a lot of things. As I said, he's an analyst on MSNBC, book author, many books, but he also writes a newsletter. He sends out a column. And I think this is where I got the sky is blue line. On his latest newsletter, he had a column that talked about, that is where I got your on it. He talks about, it's headlined, the importance of retelling the tale of Trump treachery, tying it to the work of the January 6th committee. So when you get to the end of the book, which is about, leads us up to Trump, if David were to do a postscript in a month or two, it would probably be whatever taking into, whatever happened with January 6th committee and the report. But what they are trying to do to limited success right now is put together what Trump did in the days before and during and even a bit after January 6th in his attempt to overturn the election. Why is this telling and retelling important, especially as we're speaking just a few weeks before the election and voting started in a lot of America?
Well, it sounds like a simple question, but there are a lot of different elements to it. The January 6th committee, I think, has done a champion job at telling the story of what happened. And in some ways, it shouldn't be necessary because we all saw what happened with our own eyes. We saw Donald Trump declare he had won before the votes were counted. We saw him claim time and time again various conspiracy theories that the election was stolen from him without producing any evidence that withstood scrutiny. We saw how he behaved before January 6th and how he incited his base into believing an election was stolen, which would indeed cause justifiable anger if true. This was unjustifiable anger. And we saw what happened on January 6th in terms of what he said in driving people to the Capitol. And more importantly, perhaps most important of all, we saw what didn't happen on January 6th, which was Donald Trump taking any action to stop the riot once it began. And so we know this story. It's like we saw the movie, we were in the audience, we were at the ball game, we were at the ballet, we saw it happen in front of us. And yet you have denialists out there in the Republican Party saying again and again, no, it's not, the election was stolen. There was a theft, there was rigging, and January 6th was not a big deal. It was just tourists, whatever. It's basically Monty Python, the dead parrot skit. Well, this parrot is not dead.
But look at what's going on in Arizona. The Republican candidate for governor, Carrie Lake, is in a position, again, as we speak, a few weeks before voting, polls show that she's in striking distance, and she is one of the top denialists in the nation.
And in fact, the New York Times a few days ago on the front page, and other institutions have done the same thing, had over 200, 300 Republicans who are election denialists, or some call themselves election skeptics, running for office, for Congress, Senate, governor, or statewide office throughout the land. So it really has become the predominant position within the Republican Party, the majority position. And so I say we all saw what happened. We know what happened. But it turns out that one of the tools of disinformation, which is not old, is to repeat the lie again and again and again and again. I mean, to use your example, Lynn, you say this is a pen. It's obviously a pen. You really feel you only need to say that once. But if someone's out there saying it's not a pen, it's not a pen, it's not a pen, and you keep saying it is a pen, it is a pen, you kind of feel stupid. Like how many times can you
or somebody will say the video was doctored.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah. How many times can you call a pen a pen? How many times can you point to the sky and say, yes, it is blue? Or how many times can you say we all saw what happened on January 6th? But it turns out that the disinformationalists, the fearmongers, the propagandists, will not relent. And that's why it's really important for the January 6th committee to retell the story. Of course, they have found new information and they have fleshed things out that we did not know. We now know more about what Donald Trump did not do on January 6th. And they found video of Nancy Pelosi that came out the other day. I mean, there's a lot of, I think, gripping, visceral information. They got more information about all the various attempts. There are multiple schemes that Donald Trump mounted to try to undo, overturn the election results. So they've done a great job that, but I think ultimately the most important thing they've done is just keep it fresh in our mind, because there's also a human inclination to move on, to accept things, even terrible things. And if okay, that happened, now we're going to move on. But if the other side just keeps saying, but it was evil, there was theft, Biden's not legitimate. You have to find a way to counter that and to remind your own rational side that this is indeed what happened. And then also to try to convince some people in the middle, which is very, very, very small, and on the margins of the other side, that yes, maybe you should keep this in mind. You should keep thinking about this. So retelling the story, human beings, maybe I say this because I'm a journalist, function on the basis of stories. Stories we tell ourselves, stories that we hear from others, stories about ourselves, about the world. And that's why, and Trump has a story. I'm a victim. This election was stolen from me. And he tells that story 20 times a day. Thus, it's important for the people who live in the real world to remind themselves again and again, and others, that story is false and that there is a reality.
So there is a cousin or a sibling to what you're talking about. And I grapple with this all the time, and it's called whataboutism.
Yeah.
So David Korn wants to talk about January 6th, and the person says, well, what about, which is then
Hunter Biden.
Deflection. What about Hunter Biden?
Yeah.
What about the protests that took place in the wake of the George Floyd death?
Well, actually, and through my, one of the responses to my book, to bring it back to that, is that, well, Democrats do it too. There are crazy ideas on the left, there's extremism on the left. And, so it's, both sides do it, right? What about crazy conspiracy ideas on the left about George W. Bush and the Iraq War, something like that. And I say, well, you know what? You're wrong. There's a true asymmetry here. We look for symmetry. We look for balance in the world. It's kind of reassuring. That side does it, that side does it. The truth is in the middle. But often that's not the case. Often in the world, reality is not in balance. It's not in sync. It's not equal on each side. So, the point I make is that the Republican Party has embraced various forms of extremism, and that every major Republican Party candidate and president, you can point to an instance of them doing that. Even Mitt Romney, who by all accounts is a decent fellow individually, when he ran for the presidency in 2012, he embraced Donald Trump at the time that Donald Trump was the #1 purveyor of the racist birther conspiracy theory about Barack Obama. And so he validated Donald Trump. He said, you are a member of the Republican coalition that we care about, while Donald Trump was spewing racist extremism.
Right, at that time, in the birth of birtherism, I was, as a journalist, surprised that it stuck, and was surprised that serious shows and outlets were still entertaining Trump as a serious political prospect when he was spouting that stuff.
My large point is, and we can talk about that specific case because it's a good case study, but that, again and again and again, you have Republican leaders endorsing, embracing, putting up with, accepting this crazy stuff on the right. You can't find an example of Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Michael Dukakis, Fritz Mondale, or Joe Biden embracing anything similar, embracing a conspiracy theory, saddling up. There's nothing like the John Birch Society on the left that's been embraced and accepted. And in fact, in the 60s, the left, if you want to talk about the extreme left, whether it's the anti-war movement or the hippies or the Spartacus League, whatever you want to call them, they were at war with the Democratic Party. They were protesting the Democratic Party at the '68 convention in the wonderful city of Chicago. And so the Democrats have never had this relationship with the far left or left extremism as the Republicans have had with with the right. So then you get to whataboutism, and you can say, okay, what about Hunter Biden? Well, Hunter Biden is one guy, and whatever happened with Hunter Biden and his laptop and anything is a peanut compared to an insurrectionist riot that was meant to overturn an election and throw out the votes of, what is it, 80 odd million Americans. So yeah, you can point to things you don't like on the left, but there needs to be an idea of proportionality here, right? But of course, they don't want that. They look for the deflection, and the media often takes the bait.
So you raise a question that I want to explore a little bit in the book. Why do people believe this stuff from generation to generation? We could talk about birtherism, other examples, just denialism. Election, fraudulent claims of election fraud. Why does it stick?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of good academic research about why conspiracy theories, work, why people want them. There can be simple explanations, and it can reinforce, a belief, or even more importantly, a desired belief. You want to believe Trump won, right? So if someone comes along and gives you a way you can believe that, you will accept that, and you will find your own research on the internet, or in the old days in newsletters and bulletin boards or film strips. The John Birch Society used to be great at sending out film strips for people, and you can find your own way into this. There's and there are also economic and cultural reasons that propel people. A lot of conspiracy theory sometimes is driven by, is accepted by people who don't like the changes they see in society, and they can't believe that something is happening. So they, what seems to be occurring on the surface level doesn't explain it sufficiently for them. So they have to go deeper and find the real reasons why something is happening. And you have, I think, when people feel unease, or in the 1950s and 60s, a lot of fear about the Soviet threat, or the possibility of being blown up in a nuclear war, they're easier to prey upon. And with the, and then there's racism in some instances. You look at the birth of conspiracy theory, and I think there are a lot of Americans, unfortunately, it's hard to say this, who could not accept the idea of a Black president. And so therefore they look for reasons why the system's being manipulated to give us a Black president, and reasons to find him illegitimate. Not because he's Black, because they don't want to say that, but he was born in Africa, which means he doesn't really qualify to be president. So there are a lot of factors that go into this. But in 1964, the great historian Richard Hofstadter wrote a magazine article that then became a collection of essays called The Paranoid Style of American Politics, which, he traced back, it was present at the time with the Birchers and McCarthyism, but he traced it back, to the beginning of the Revolution, the American Revolution. And, my book has has an opening chapter on the history of conspiracy theory in American politics, but it's not new. There was the anti-Masonic Party in the mid 1800s, the early 1800s, at the birth of the Republic. There was a outcry against secret societies, the Illuminati, which didn't really exist, but that the Federalists used in terms of going after Jefferson and his party. I mean, it was quite vicious, the politics like that there, and it was predicated on some very crazy conspiratorial notions. So it's always been there, Lynn. I think as we've become a more mass society, and we can talk about the impact the internet has on it, it's become, deeper, more deeply rooted, and with Donald Trump has come more to the fore.
I mean, you're right that there have been paranoid conspiracies since the nation was born, and that you talk about how political extremism was driven from anti-immigrant thoughts, anti-Catholic thought, and it goes up to KKK, labor activists, and all that. And with that, David, we're wrapped up. Thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate everything that you've said. I think the things to think about here and the takeaways come as we go into a period, David, where things are fraught. We're talking before the election, before the midterms, and before we know if Donald Trump is going to run again. But I just had the realization there is one last question I should ask you.
Okay, Columbo.
One last question. If Donald Trump does pursue another presidential run, do you think as we speak he can win?
I think the answer is of course. I mean, I in 2016, I remember you and I talking, and I always said that he had a chance to win the Republican nomination. I'm not sure I would have bet on it, but I never dismissed him as like, this won't happen. And I said, anyone who gets the Republican nomination, no matter who it is, it could be Snoopy, but Snoopy would be actually better than Donald Trump. But anybody would have a chance of winning the general because of the way the public was so divided and the way the Electoral College works. So just listening to myself from 6 years ago, I'd have to say that of course it can happen again. He could run again, and I think the odds are probably better this time around of him getting the nomination if he runs again, because he has the party under his control. And if he's the nominee, yeah, I mean, 77,000 votes last time, flipped in 3 states, would have made him president, and maybe that would have led to him becoming king for life. We don't know. So I'm out there, writing and reporting and trying to suss out what I can. If anybody wants to get my newsletter, they can go to davidcorn.com and sign up for that. It's called Our Land, but davidcorn.com, and follow me on Twitter. You can always find an easy way to buy my book because I'm always pushing it. But I do think that everything we've talked about, Lynn, everything that you've covered for the last 6 years, it's not going away. Trumpism won't go away, even if Trump decides not to run or is defeated. And these are just issues that are going to confound and confront American society and the people who write about it for years to come.
David Corn, the author of American Psychosis, a historical investigation of how the Republican Party went crazy. Thanks for joining me at the Table.
Thank you.